Good morning and welcome back to the Isle of Faces. Welcome. Come, grab yourself a log, come and have a sit on the grass and say hello. I am Sir Buckley, your resident green person here in the Isle, and we're glad to see you again. I hope you've been enjoying your break here between feast and dance. The Yarn has missed you. I hope you've missed us too. I am speaking to you from it's fairly cloudy, it's getting a bit colder, but the sun is persevering, so I persevere along with it. I've been lucky enough to be out in the sunny countryside of late, so I'm still going. I hope it's nice where you are as well. And yes, here we are, back again here on the Isle with all you wonderful people. It's been weird not talking to you, but it's always nice to have a little break. I'm sure you always need a bit of a break from my monotonous voice. And not to worry, because I know you're always in good hands with the rest of the Aswath community and all the different podcasts and essays you can be reading across the board. I know for a fact none of you have time to get to them all because there's just too many. It's impossible. But it is still much fun to gather on the Isle and welcome you back with this little teeny tiny Dance with Dragons kind of prepper episode, whatever you'd like to call it. Just a little thing to keep us going here and just remind us of what we're about to tackle, because it's pretty darn big. But we'll get to that in a second. Just before we get to that, what has been happening in this little break? Well, I should probably first say this is not the end of the break. This isn't an announcement podcast. I still not sure when Aziz and Asher want to kick off dance. Not sure when Valar Rereadis will be back. You might have even heard before I have. I think on the Feast wrap-up episode, Aziz mentioned sometime in October or late September, so we're probably coming close. I'm sure it won't be too long. And yeah, I know you've been spoilt for content anyway. Even Aziz hasn't given a rest. I see him putting out his stream still, so not even that much of a break. What about the Isle? What's been happening on the Isle of Faces? Well, hopefully you've seen that I eventually did get the Storm's End patron-only episode out. That's out for all tiers now. That came out last week as I'm talking to you here. And, well, I was glad because it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work. I really put a lot of effort into that one. Thankfully, had some good reception, and thank you to all our wonderful patrons, firstly, for being patrons, but also for sharing that and giving good feedback, and apparently it went quite well. So if you haven't heard, it is my reading of the first chapter of The Great Castles of Westeros by yours truly, the Storm's End chapter, and yeah, I go through it all. I read the chapter in full, I put some extra little tidbits in, some meta commentary perhaps, a little bit about the book in general, and I answer some questions from you guys about Storm's End and the book also. So if you would like to have a little peek at that, then it's available to all patrons from $1 and up. I'm sure you know where to go by now, and we'd love to have you just in general. We've got a nice community going, and well, everyone is awesome. You know how much I love them, and yeah, it was really fun to finally get that out, especially with some cool stormy sound effects. That was my favourite bit by far, just finding the rain effects and putting those in. So yeah, if you'd like to have a look at that, patreon.com/Isle of Faces, well, of course, be very much appreciated. I've also, now finally got that done, started some work on that Winterfell walkthrough that I teased both on Radio Westeros and History of Westeros. Had to get a new camera, so I was waiting for that, but that's going full steam ahead as well, so that won't be too long, hopefully. And, well, mainly it's been doing this. So let's talk about what we're actually doing today. What are we doing, Joe? Come on. We're not starting just yet. Like I say, the dance, Varamir, he has to wait a little bit longer. But what we are going to do is prep ourselves today. We're going to go through all the nerdy stuff, the stuff that I really like. I'm not sure if you do, but I know I do. They're looking at the difference in which POVs we've got, who's got how many, how does the structure work, who's gained POVs, who's lost them, who is now more prevalent in the early books to the latter, and looking at all these patterns and stuff like that. And we're going to be looking at just kind of arcs and themes of this book, what's different about this book, what's the same, who connects with who is where, etc, etc. Basically just of a little bit of a refresher and pre-fresher, that's probably a word, for all of you guys. I don't know about you, but I find dance the hardest to remember, I assume because I've read it the least. You would think I've read it as much as any others, because I don't think I've ever started a reread and stopped, but it just seems much more unfamiliar to me. I have to remind myself of the details a bit more. So this is for me as much as you, and yeah, like I say, the nerdy stuff. It's similar to what we did at the beginning of Feast, if you want to cast your mind back. And that's why I've made a little separate episode this time around, because you might recall at the beginning of Feast, Aziz said the first 3 chapters, it was Pate and Aeron and Aereo. And I said on that episode, it probably won't be too long of an episode. We've only got 3 chapters to do today compared to our normal 4 or 5, depending on what book you're doing. So this will be pretty simple. And it turned out to be a 2-hour episode because at the beginning I said, okay, well, let's just quickly go through who's got how many POVs and what patterns we can see, the chapter sequencing. You know, I love the chapter sequencing. And it was like 45 minutes, 50 minutes before we even started talking about Pate. So this is to try and solve that issue. We're going to get all that stuff out of the way today so that whenever we do start Dance proper, we can head into the darkness that is Varamir. Very, very dark chapter that is, and hit the ground running. So, like I say, we've got chapter sequencing, we've got the individual arcs, the arcs of the book in general, the different themes, how this book is different and why it's so, it's an important book. A lot of people tout this as their favourite book. And fair enough, I can see why. For me, I would say, if I'm being honest, it's probably my least favourite. Now, don't throw down your phones or grab your pitchforks or anything like that. I'm not saying I do not like Dance. So don't quote me saying that. I'm just saying, if I had to sacrifice one, I would sacrifice this. I still love it more than anything else. The very worst of A Song of Ice and Fire is still way up high on the mountain compared to everything else. I'm just saying I don't like it as much. Maybe I will after we go through this reread and I can understand it a bit more and gain a bit more appreciation. There you go, that's what I've said. I've said it, I'll have to stick by it now. But it is an important book. It's a masterful book. Of course it is. It's from George. It's masterful. We love it, even if we don't love it as much as the others. So we're going to have a lot to talk about, some very big issues, obviously major plot developments. Yeah, really major plot developments. And, well, it's just taking us into this final act, isn't it? If you want to look at Feast as, I don't want to call it a timeout, but like we discussed, it deviates to George letting his wings spread a bit and focusing on some other things while he can. Now this is kind of making up for that. Now we're rushing full forward into the beginning of the end. I think we can probably call Dance. If you want to look at the first 3 books as the beginning of the beginning and the beginning of the middle and I guess the end of the beginning. I'm getting lost in a time pool there. I think we should probably just start. Yeah, that might. Otherwise, I'm going to end up with the same problem we had at the beginning of Feast, where I wander and ramble before I even get to the wandering and rambling bit. So let's dive straight in. Let's look at the biggest changes in terms of who we're actually getting in this book. Okay, so we begin with Goodbye, Brienne.
So our biggest loss, the one I'm going to miss the most, and also Sam. They're the 2 most noticeable changes. But also Sansa. Okay, Brienne and Sam had more chapters, more of the percentage in Feast, but Sansa is huge, narratively, or obviously. We've never had a book without her, so this is very much new ground. I think it's fair to include her in that upper echelon of POV characters, 2 characters we get across the whole series, so it's going to be very, very weird not having a book with Sansa in, even if we do have Bran back to replace her, but we'll come to him in a minute. There's also, in terms of people we lose, Aegon, Arianne, and obviously Aris Oakheart. He's not coming back, is he? So not a good day for the A's, is it? But given that they together made up a grand total of 5 chapters, it's also not that big of a loss. So who do we have to replace them then? Well, it's only 4. I think you might think it's more than 4 just off the glance, but yeah, only 4 new POVs in this book. Half of the 8 we got for Feast, but still pretty big. They are Quentin, he's going to take over as Mr. Dawn. Barristan, John Connington, which is a bigger deal when you find out or you remember who that actually is, and Melisandre. So not a bad lineup of newbies at all. I think if you were going into this book blind and I just rocked up and told you exactly who you're getting as new POVs, you'd be pretty excited about that crowd. So let's look at them individually. Well, Quentin, we don't know basically anything about him, do we? Other than he's got this secret mission that Arianne told us about, that Duran kind of hinted at. So we know vaguely what he's going to be up to, so the plot is definitely interesting, but him, we really don't know. What we can sell him as is the last Martell we're yet to meet. Because I think we do technically very quickly see Trystane, but anyone never cares about Trystane. So that's kind of cool, isn't it? But probably going to move on from him fairly quickly. Then we have a former Hand of the King and Rhaegar's best friend. So that's very exciting that we want Jon Con as someone just close to Rhaegar even before we know of his actual plot in this book. Because people left from Robert's Rebellion, that era, who were strictly involved in court life, are in very short supply, just as characters, let alone as POVs. Jaime's really all we've had for remembering that era and those events ever since Ned died, so we're kind of really desperate for that. And we're always desperate for more Rhaegar information, aren't we? Especially since Aemon has now passed away. But the other two, I think that's the real moneymaker. That's the one that's going to draw you in. If you're kind of on the edge about reading Dance, I don't know, depends what new POVs they introduce. Okay, well, I've got two to sell it for you here, in Melisandre and Barristan Selmy. We're going to step into the head of this magical woman who has dark powers that we don't even know the origins of, who knows secrets we can only dream about, and obviously has some master plans that may well affect the entire world and definitely characters that we know about. Remember, she happens to be near one of our main characters at the most magical place we've ever found at the Wall. So yes, sign us up for that, please. I definitely want to be inside Melisandre's head and find out what is going on, because she's definitely one of the people we've had the most questions about. And then even after that, because your enthusiasm might dampen when I tell you we're only getting one Melisandre chapter, but even after that we're getting Sir Grandfather himself, Sir Barry, a fan favourite at this point, and still for many even after this book. He's the awesome guy who was really the only one to actually get on with Ned down in King's Landing. We saw him throw his sword at Joffrey's feet and then cross the world to help our favourite Daenerys. Now, opinions might sour on him a bit at this point, but like I say, for many he's still a favourite. I still very much like Barristan, flaws and all. Yes, I'm well aware of the flaws, but still I can like him. And actually it's just important because this is going to be our very first POV around Daenerys that isn't Daenerys herself. So that's a big moment. Now, annoyingly, as we'll come to talk about in a minute, because these POVs are placed so very differently across the book, we're not actually going to see Barristan with Daenerys through his eyes all that much. It's going to be after she departs. But still, we get to see the Daenerys situation through another person's eyes, which also hasn't happened before. So that's the newbies, but it's really the returners that steal the show. And why is that? Because we always have the returners. They're fairly consistent from book to book. Except that's not true anymore, is it? That was true for the first three, very consistent, but not anymore. For the first time, we now have a bunch of characters who have been missing for an entire book, now returning to us. And that was damn daring of George in the first place, wasn't it, to actually take all those characters, some smaller than others, but he took the three major ones, the most major ones you can get, he took them away for an entire book's run. That is very, very daring. That might easily have not worked, but it has, and it actually just made us wanting more, didn't it? But before we get onto those, the ones who have been missing, there's also the other group of returners, this little subsection of those who were included in Feast and now get the rare Dance Feast combo. They get to be in both. So that includes Arya, so at least we have one Stark sister, hooray. Jaime and Cersei also jump over as the Feast big guns, which gets Jaime in the noticeable group of Tyrion, Dany, Jon, Sansa, Arya, Bran and Catelyn as the only POVs to appear in 3 straight books, we should note that. And then there's also Areo, Victarion and Asher, although only one of those is really of note. Areo and Victarion repeat their 1 and 2 chapter appearances respectively, but Asher gets bumped from 1 in Feast to 3 in Dance, and her 3 are some of the best, so that's definitely worth mentioning. Also worth mentioning, if you thought Feast was a step outside the box in terms of structuring, well, let me introduce you to Dance, which applies most of its oddity to this particular low POV group. For instance, let me explain. Areo does not appear until the 38th chapter of the book. Arya, not until the 45th. Jaime, the 48th. Cersei, the 54th. Victarion, the 56th. So you get what I mean, there's a big group of POVs here who don't even appear until we are really, really far into the book. And a large part of that is, of course, the timeline that is noted to us at the beginning of the book here, where the Feast folk, which is what these mainly are, have to let the dancers catch up before they can start again. But they also just don't get that much of the limelight. There's less chapters for them to go around because we need to catch up on all these other people. Instead of that group, which we will return to in some fashion in a moment, we want to really talk about the actual returners, the real ones, the ones gone from us for over an entire book length now because we haven't been able to talk about them for ages. And considering the weight of these characters in general, well, it gets us pretty ramped up for this book. So let me remind you, coming back to us are Bran, Davos, Theon, who's actually been on from 2 books, not 1, and of course the Golden Triforce, that is Tyrion, Jon and Dany. I don't think we really need to sit here and explain how big those 3 are narratively, just those 3 alone, let alone the other 3 as well. But still. Let's also consider how most of these were actually left for us, on the edge of huge new steps in their lives, which we were desperate to find out about before George played his greatest trick and made us all wait for an entire book. Oh George, how cruel. So quickly, let's just remind you of what those situations were. Bran, he finally crossed over into the wild realm where the apparent source of his super important powers is supposed to reside. So, well, what's happened? Has he got there? Are we going to open on him already having found that teacher and improved his powers? Or are we going to have to go through this next part of the trip with him. We know how dangerous it is above the wall. We've seen what's out there, especially in Storm when we last left him. So is he going to have to go through kind of what Sam went through in reverse? And what about Theon? Theon's supposed to be dead. So what in the world has been happening to this man who the consequences of his actions have only really been seen since his disappearance? We thought the destruction of Winterfell was bad enough, which we saw through his eyes and Bran's eyes, but now we know it's also largely responsible for Robb and Catelyn's death. So we're ready to hate him even more at the opening of this book. Yeah, we want to see him. Yeah, I'm going to give him what for. And then we actually do see him, pathetic and broken as he is, and it completely changes our mind, completely changes our opinion of him, at least in a large part. I think we all know that's one of George's greatest accomplishments in this whole series, is that complete turnaround of opinion on Theon and just approach to Theon. So that's going to be really good to look at. What about Davos? Our beloved Davos is now returned to us. The last we saw, he was saving Edric Storm and daring to stand up to Stannis on Dragonstone. Then, next we knew, Stannis was on the wall, and our fan favourite Davos wasn't. So, where did he go? Well, in a rarity, Feast actually did tell us this time round. He went to White Harbour, and he died. Apparently, that's what we've been told. So going in, well, okay, he's a POV, so are we going to have to see his death? Is George really going to make us read an arc where we know this fan favourite of ours is going to die at the end? Surely not, George. Surely George wouldn't be that cruel. And it turns out he's not, but still, we have to worry, don't we? And again, there's those big three. Tyrion had just made his biggest act of the series and killed Tywin Lannister before taking to sea. Now, he's brought up probably more than the other two in Feast thanks to Cersei's many chapters and that fruitless search of hers, so we've had plenty of time to make our guesses about where he's going and what he's doing, but we're yet to actually find out what his new adventure is, because we know, okay, something pretty major has just happened to you, Tyrion, and we want to see what you're going to do about it. Now, I don't think any of us are prepared for the Tyrion we actually get, especially at the beginning here, but we're definitely very, very interested to see where he's going to end up, especially because near the end of Storm, he was kind of thinking, I could go down to Messena, I could crown her, we could get that going. And well, we saw Dawn in Feast, so we know he hasn't turned up there yet, so where else could he possibly go? And the mind gets going. Now, what about the other two? Because with both Storm and Dance, the mirror between Dany and Jon is strong as ever in where we left them and what's going to happen to them in this book. Jon, who we did briefly see in Feast, but come on, I'm counting him as a returner here. Jon, he had just been made Lord Commander with a king upon his wall and the wildlings defeated, so how was he going to handle all that? How is he going to handle Stannis, all these wildling captives, the great big thing coming down from the true north? Pretty important questions. And the same type of questions applied to Dany, who had her own victory in Meereen, but she chose to stay and be a queen. So how's that going? Are you ruling well? Is this all wrapped up pretty neatly? Are we going to be going to Westeros soon? Oh, no, apparently not. And it's going to be very similar for the both of them. A frustrating rule where everything you do either pisses someone off or outright endangers them. All the while, you're trying to save people you believe are your responsibility. So both of them are going to have to give more and more of themselves away to try and get that job done. And I think with both of them, we're going to feel, going through this, that the boil will rise and rise, both at the Wall and the Meereen, until it eventually spills over for both of them, and they strike out, only to face dire consequences near immediately. The path of the heroes moves ever further away from the standard, and George really does lay a muddy sea of reality. This isn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be something closer to Dany's Storm arc. You go around conquering and freeing all the slaves, and everyone cheers you, and now just go on to Westeros. It's easy, just keep doing it. But we're not going to get that. We're not going to get Jon winning the war for the Night's Watch. We're not going to have those great big moments. We're going to have reality, the realities of rule and growing up, and the difficulty of it all, difficulty of many different factions, which again, both of them have to deal with in their respective places. There's also this sense of them just both paying their dues almost, because they ultimately just want to save people. That's the goal for both of them here, even though it does get mixed in with what they personally want as well. That's the other part of it. But really, it's just more both of them looking bigger picture as we go, which you can only assume is going to increase in Wins and Dream, isn't it? So now we've got through who's a returner or a rookie. Let's look at what they will actually be getting in this book in terms of percentage. How much playtime are they going to be getting here? So we thought we had a big jump up in Feast, but it's even bigger now with 16 different POV characters. So that's double what we got originally in A Game of Thrones, if you keep in count. Which is a good comment on the continuation of the series, but also the evolution of George's writing style and focus. There's a long time between writing this book and the first one, and George's changed a bit. He spread his wings. We talked a lot about that for Feast. He quite enjoys doing that, and well, we're luckier for it, aren't we? So that does paint the two books, Feast and Dance, together in terms of expanding the scope of the story. But in this one, I'd say we get more characters with less settings, whereas Feast is probably the reverse, if you get my meaning. Now, to compare it to a different book, Dance borrows from Storm by having an epilogue on top of its prologue. They're the only two to do that. And we'll talk more on the prologue at a different time, but for now, let's just quickly mention the epilogue because it's obviously our biggest prologue/epilogue character to date in Kevin Lannister. We've never got access to someone that well known in any other prologue or epilogue, so that's going to be very, very interesting, even if it's quite a while off yet. And there's other similarities between the two books as well. There's 72 chapters to 81 in Storm's favour, but apparently just a mere 2,000 words difference between them also in Storm's favour, so expect a few longer chapters for Dance here. And what about the unenviable challenge of how we're going to sort out these 72 chapters? Which POV goes where and in what order, etc, etc. We've spoken so much throughout this project about the chapter sequencing, you know I'm obsessed with that, and how George is going to play these off one against the other and laying the themes and laying the connections and the foreshadowing and everything else. I'd perhaps say this is one of my most enjoyable things to look for in this project, and one of the things I've learned the most about the series and about George and how he does it, so I really like that. Now, we've already spoken about it being something very different in this book, in having several POVs showing up much, much later. But before looking at where they go, let's have a quick reminder of who gets how much. What's the minutes, coach? How many am I getting here? We'll do it in tiers. So the first tier is for characters with 1 to 2 POV chapters. And that is Melisandre, Jaime, Cersei, Aeryo, Victarion, Jon Con, and Arya. So already, that's 7 of your 16 characters right there, with only 1 to 2, so you can see how just vastly different this is to what we've dealt with before. And there's obviously a huge drop off for Jaime and Cersei, that's the biggest difference here, but that's to be expected, isn't it? Because, again, like we said, they have to let the others play catch up first. The others, they're mostly fine, that's what we'd expect, okay? Like we've already said, Aeryo, Victarion, we've already got that from you. Mel, yeah, we'd want more than 1, sure. Jon Con, we don't really know yet, but the most striking is obviously Arya, because, alright, it's only 1 less than Feast, but it's just so strange to us still, because she had so many in Clash and Storm especially. So combine that with Bran, that means we're getting 6 Stark chapters in Feast, and down to 5 here, so it's actually getting less. Now, I think we all agree that's going to see a big upswing during wins, but still, it's just very odd to us. It just doesn't quite feel right, does it, not having the Starks around? And it also means we're not going to have that usual Sansa Arya mirroring that we've become so accustomed to and is so enjoyable. Bran does come back, and he only has 3, as we'll discuss in a second. So, similar to Arya, but it's not the same. It's not that same connection. So this is very, very different of what we're dealing with here. And especially considering Feast as well, that Sansa and Arya were placed very regularly. They both had a clear beginning, middle and end placed in those points throughout the novel. Not the same here. We'll have Bran at the beginning and then Arya doesn't even appear until later. Again, we'll discuss that. Let's discuss it now. Let's do the next tier. These are the ones with 3 to 7 POV chapters. And that is Bran and Asher with 3. And then we have this mini group here of Quentyn, Davos and Barristan with 4. And for some reason I always remember Bran as 4, but no, it is 3. So they're the mini adventurers there, those last 3 that I just mentioned there, Quentyn, Davos and Barristan. George seems to have mastered the kind of 4-chapter adventure during this book. Now, that's pretty basic for Bran and Davos, that's not too different to what they get before, a little less for Bran. Now Quentyn, he has already equalled the total Dornish chapters from Arryn and Arianne, so well done to him. Passing on from those, Theon comes in with 7, he's a bit of a loner, he's the only one of that number, and that's more than I would have guessed if you'd asked me before this. He had 6 in Clash, so a little bit of a step up from him, but then let's get on to the big guns again. All 3, unsurprisingly, are in double figures. Dany at 10, Tyrion with 12, and Jon gets 13 top dog spot. So pretty similar to what we normally see from them. Dany, she equals her high from Game of Thrones, which she hasn't actually got close to since, so we're spoilt in that regard, lots more Daenerys. And there's a nice comparison going because those first 10 chapters back in Game of Thrones were all about a journey for her. Whereas this one, the whole point of this one, is the lack of movement and progress and the lack of journey. She's staying still and it frustrates her until the very end. So that's a nice little comparison there. Tyrion is the reverse. He journeyed in Game of Thrones as well, but since then he was in one place. Not anymore. Now he's journeying, at least for most of this book. And his chapters are just short of his Clash total and just above his Storm total, so he's right in the middle there. Jon reaches a new career high, just edging out his Storm number to reach 13 this time. Like we say, that is the first time he is atop the pile, which rings familiar with his actual arc as the new leader. Now that's the easy part through. Where do you actually put them all? It's easy just to write the chapters and decide how many you get, but how am I actually going to put this together to make a flowing narrative book? Well, you'll notice in the first few episodes of the dance chapters for Scraps and Scrolls that George wants to make an early impression with getting his Triforce trio on the board first. They're the ones we miss the most, they're the ones we're most hungry for, and George doesn't disappoint, doesn't make us wait any longer than he has to. Obviously, all three of them are regular throughout, given their high number of chapters, but we'll also see them placed together 3 different times, and often actually just missing out on a couple more there. Although I will say it's more noticeable that Jon and Dany are next to each other 7 times during this book. So George is starting to lose some of his subtlety on that matter as we progress now in that comparison between these two for these arcs. And the only other thing to notice at this point is something even Feast did not really have. Arcs racking up very, very early, even before the halfway point. Now, okay, that's easy with Mel or Arya, they only have 1 chapter, don't they? But what about Davos and Bran? Both of those are wrapped up by the 34th chapter, about halfway. So that's an oddity to have that done so early, isn't it? And I'm unsure why, to be honest, especially in Bran, who isn't near any of the other plots, so you can have him wherever you like. For Davos, it makes a bit more sense because he has to be dealt with before Wyman heads to Winterfell. Although you could have given him more chapters later on, if you didn't want to hold him back for wins. And Barry, like we said earlier, he doesn't even start until very late in the book. So moving on from that, remember that many of these plots were formed with the 5-year gap in mind, more so than those that were transferred to Feast, I think, in terms of Jon and Dany especially. So we'll see some remnants of that and how George has had to kind of double back and fold them into current times a little bit. But we'll talk about that as we go through these chapters, especially in the early ones, for Dany, for Jon, and for others as well. But to be fair, I think you just forget that as you're reading. Dance is its own book, and these arcs are their own arcs. They're completely separate. You forget that fairly quickly. You can find it if you look for it, but I think, no, we're finding out new stuff about these characters we've been waiting for so long and where they're heading out to.
So now, considering all that, let's start to look at some of these actual individual arcs. And I know a lot of it slipped through already just in talking about how many POVs we've all got, so I'll try to avoid repeating myself. I might be giving myself a bit of an editing task here, but well, we'll see how we go. We're going to look at the arcs, the themes, how they're going to blend in together, and what we've got this time around. As with Feast, it is a much more extrapolated story in terms of people versus position. We're going to see a lot of different places. They're all going to be viewed, if not quite as many as Feast, or at least not as many particularly focused on. We do kind of rush through some places on Tyrion's journey and other people's journeys, but there are a lot to consider. New places, new people, new ideas, new things we're going to have to deal with. So how should we look at this? I think we'll go geographically. Who do we have grouped together in terms of the plot? Because normally the plot is working together geographically, not always, but I think that's how we're going to break it up. And again, I will say, I know some of it slipped through already, so not everyone will get equal focus. I don't want to repeat myself, but well, we'll see how we go, shall we? I'll probably just cut all this out as I edit anyway, because I know I am rambling. Let's just start at the top of the map, Joe. Shut up and get on with it. So Bran, he is obviously the furthest north. He is above the wall. And apart from Varamir, he's the only one this time. And, well, a little bit of Tiny Jon here and there. But he's the furthest north, and he's pretty far removed from what's going on. He's basically in his own little bubble here. He'll have a teeny tiny crossover with Theon himself, but even that's not explicit, although there will be plenty of connections for us to make through the Weirwood later on. Bran, he has a pretty straightforward arc in his 3 chapters. Not 4, I always think it's 4. It's 3. It's 2 for the end of his journey, plus 1 really important in his last chapter, where we get his life in the cave, his learning, and, like I just said, those visions of Winterfell and the past that we love so much. So it sounds good when saying it like that. Great, that's what we want, isn't it? Bran gets where he wants to go. Bran starts learning. Mission accomplished. Ooh, okay. But this is Dance with Dragons, so it's actually a bit more darker than that. Whether it's Cold Hands, it's Blood Raven, even with Jojen at the end, we're made to consider what death is and who's dead and who isn't, and Bran's linked to death now. Bran seems to be leaving the living world, doesn't he? He's left literally the living world in terms of not winter. He's entered this land of extreme cold, no food anywhere, everything's kind of bare and lifeless. Now he's left the world of above ground. He's back down like he was before in the crypts, beneath the earth, into this kind of secret, hidden area when he's just kind of removed completely. And like I say, there's so many links of death in terms of the people he's with, the ancientness of the children of the forest, all these bones everywhere, and they talk a lot about death and what happened to them. So it's just very, very prevalent in this little arc. Then we get on top of that Bran's potential links to cannibalism, his unknowing abominations with Hodor, as George continues to brilliantly paint him as a mostly innocent, ever-learning little boy, even when he's placed in clearly the most magical and mysterious setting we've seen yet. No disrespect to Winterfell or the Wall or anywhere else, but I think we can agree Bloodraven's cave is a cut above. And George, he's often said that he finds Bran hardest to write, but I think you're doing pretty well there, George. As everyone knows, I'm not particularly a Bran fan, or at least I'm not a Bran chapter fan. I don't have any problem with the character or what gets done in his storyline, but normally when I come across a Bran chapter, I kind of eye roll a little bit. But I do actually like Dance Bran. Possibly because there's only 3 chapters, but I just feel the pace is a bit more moved up from early Storm and definitely the first 2 books. Maybe it's just because we get a little delivery on these promises. He does actually get there. He does actually get to do something with these powers, or at least we get the hints of it. Maybe it's just because I love past Weirwood visions so much, but I approve of Bran and his arc here. And yeah, like I say, very, very dark. We're going to be talking a lot about those abominations, especially early on. And really, it's just we're watching Bran be guided down a dark path. Cold hands makes him eat humans, we think. Bloodraven, who knows what he's making him do? And it seems whether it's the right thing to do or it's just the necessary, okay, I know we're taking advantage of this kid, but we got to save the world. We don't know that yet. But whatever it is, it's dark. And well, that fits into all those theories I keep rambling on about all the Stark children having to go down a very dark path before the end. But we shall see. But I think that's a good way to start off this roundup of themes, because pretty much everyone is going to be leaning further into the darker side of things. And that's definitely true with his nearest POV, like I said a minute ago, is Varamir, with all that warging and abomination stuff, and Varamir just being one of the worst people we meet in the series. That's no joke, he really is. And I won't go too much into why, because he's obviously going to be first up when we do start off Scraps and Scrolls properly, but he just happens to be nearest geographically. Now, Varamir, he doesn't really have an arc, he's just got the 1 chapter. So what's his purpose? Well, it's mainly giving plenty of information on Bran, but also for Jon and his warging stuff, and giving these hints of what's going to happen at the end of the book for Jon. Even if in the moment, in the reading, obviously we don't know what's going to happen to Jon, so we're just thinking, oh, Bran this, Hodor that, oh dear. But then we'll see later how much he really ties into both of those Stark boys. The clever part of that is George still makes you think of Jon, because the actual circumstances why Varamir is where he is and what's happened to him is connected to Jon and the battle on the wall. So that's a really nice start off to the book to remind us, hey, you got to think of the chronology here and the timeline. We're not at the end of Feast, we're still at the end of Storm. That battle has just happened. We're going to be dealing with the repercussions, and then we've got to catch up to the end of Feast. So that's a good idea from George to get that in right away. We get stuff on the wildlings, like I said, the aftermath of Stannis and what's going on there. So that's a really important chapter, like I said, and really, really dark. Right from the beginning, and it really doesn't stop. I'm not going to spoil too much. I've already kind of reread that and done the notes of Scraps and Scrolls, but let me tell you, prepare yourselves. George does not start off lightly in this book. What about elsewhere in the north? Because we do have quite a few POVs coming and going here. And they'll begin quite far apart, but then the longer the book goes on, the closer they'll become. They'll kind of contract. Now on the wall, specifically, is Jon Snow and Melisandre, which is an important pairing going forward if there ever was one for wins. Now we'll return to Jon in a moment, because we've kind of discussed his arc and dance journey a little bit already. I think you all know what's going on there. So let's look at Mel instead. Melisandre we cruelly only get the 1 chapter for, but it's still pretty amazing in terms of poking holes in some long-held theories or hopes or questions. There's this big reveal that most of her stuff, most of her magic is really just illusions and tricks of the trade, but then that some things really are magical. And also, probably more importantly, that Melisandre doesn't know half as much as she claims, or she's not certain of as much as she claims. She's really just kind of riding the wave. And this looks like this thing, I'm going to go with it. I really hope it's true. No one knows anyway, so if I act confident, that's 90% of the task for me. So given that this is such a precarious bubbling situation throughout the book, but especially at the end, well, that's not great, is it? We're really waiting to get more from Melisandre. I think we can bet she's going to have more than the 1 chapter in Winds of Winter, and definitely is going to be of high importance, possibly her highest importance in the series. What would you say her most important act is so far? Is it like guess under Storm's End, and yeah, it must be, I suppose. So I think we're going to fly straight past that. Now I'm going to move on from Melisandre. As much as I love her, she's only got one chapter arc. We do need to get on. So elsewhere, we have 3 POVs very much involved in the war for the North. The one that Jon tries so hard to not be a part of. There is both Theon and Asher Greyjoy, and then Davos Seaworth. And Davos, he takes the early shift. We get him early on, or we get him more early on than the other 2. We learn plenty about Stannis' campaign for Winterfell and going south from Jon, but it's Davos who's actually out knocking on doors and getting the hard work done, doing the graft. And he's doing it in a part of the North we've never been to yet. And even though his story wraps up before everyone else really gets going, it's still very important early on. Now, he actually only has 3 chapters in the North out of his 4, as he has a pit stop at Sisterton, which belongs to the Vale. It's one of the harder chapters for me to figure out why it's included off memory alone. Which is the great thing about doing this reread project, is that we can go back, remind ourselves, have another sift through for why it is important, why it's included. So yeah, we're going to have to look for that when we get there, which is fairly early on, actually. He's one of the first non-big trio chapters we get to, so we look forward to that. I think the main purpose probably is to show that dear old Davos is down on his luck again. Classic Davos, really. That's how we're going to start off this little arc. As we mentioned earlier, it's just been so long that we've been waiting to see what he's up to. That's all we want to know. After that amazing, risky effort to save Edric Storm at the, well, kind of, not even the end of Storm of Swords, but early on, kind of. And, well, Davos is just the guy that can't catch a break, isn't he? And things don't get much better for him as he progresses. He winds up in a cell. We will start getting really worried that we're going to have to actually watch him die. This from this info we've got from Feast, especially when Wyman Manderley specifically declares that is what is going to happen. He is going to die after that superb chapter in the Merman's Court. That is a superb chapter because we learn more about the games within games, the ambition of Northmen, Northern politics in general, and all this stuff about George playing more tricks on us, again, about Davos and his eventual fates. And how just complex that whole Northern politics situation is. Obviously that comes before the classic, much loved final Davos chapter with Wyman Manderley's speech, and really the ultimate hype up chapter for this meeting of all of the North in Winterfell, Stannis versus Roose, what's going to be happening there. And we're going to learn Feast will not be the only book full of Frey revenge, so you know we like that. And again, it also ends on another Davos cliffhanger. Not of his death this time, just to be something different, but I think he might get that treatment more than any other character. Let's keep it in the North. Let's move to the brother-sister combo, because they pick up the slack later on as they show up on opposite sides of the Northern War until we have one on the outside with Stannis and one on the inside with the Boltons, and then actually their eventual re-meet at the very end. I don't think we need to discuss Theon too much here. We know what we're getting, really. The darkest arc, the darkest single book arc probably, in A Song of Ice and Fire. Is there really any comparison, anything that makes us quite this uncomfortable, anything that makes us ask real questions about our own wants for the man that we last saw burning down our collective home? I've spoken many times about Winterfell being the centre of this series, emotionally and spiritually, and Theon burned it. Maybe not himself, but you know what he did, he brought it all about. So we blamed him, we hated him, and now George thinks, aha, I've not had enough challenges taken on with this series apparently. I'm going to set myself another one. I bet I can make you like this person that you hated. Or if not like, at least feel sorry for. And to be fair, does a pretty good job. This is going to be such a deep dive into just stuff you wouldn't even imagine that someone would try and make us think about. This broken psychology, the most vicious of violence that Theon suffered. And in fairness, we will get some form of growth. I don't know how you imagine that's going to happen after just reading the first chapter, but we do get it, as Reek at least resembles Theon again in some ways, although don't kid yourself, that is not without many emotional and physical scratches along the way. It's by no means any easy path, which of course we know George doesn't do from Jaime and Tyrion and others. There is no quick fix for Theon whatsoever. This is going to be a painful book for him. Considering all the pain he's been through since we last saw him in Clash, this book isn't going to be all that much difference. And I think there is a reason that this arc, like I say, this single book arc, is one of the more famous, not just of Dance, but for the whole series among the fandom. There's a reason everyone obsesses over it, analyses it so much, because it's brilliant. It is mind-boggling. Firstly, for the sheer surprise that exists. I don't think anyone expected that. But then the terrible bleakness of it all and the emotions it elicits out of us. And again, for the wonderful analysis that has been done on it over the years by many different sources. I'm sure you know, I don't need to repeat. I know I've read it, I'm sure you have as well, or listened to it. But it's also what we get out of Theon. If you can stand to get past all the initial toe loss and mind terrors and rat eating, this is a Theon who takes us back to Winterfell. It's a Theon who takes us back to the Godswood. Again, that spiritual centre, the place we've wanted to be back at for so long. If you're anything like me, I know that's what I've wanted to do since the end of Clash, really. 2 books now, we've been missing it. Basically 3 by the time we get there. Theon's the one, Theon's the vehicle to do it for us. And I don't think anyone ever expected that return. Maybe we guessed, yeah, we're going to get back to Winterfell at some point. But I don't think anyone guessed we're going to be doing it in the eyes of the man who first took it away from us. So it's just a brilliant overall arc from George. And again, just in terms of this one book, it's superb as a single book journey. We've got plenty of examples of people having single book journeys. Theon himself, one of them from Clash. And this is really up there at the top. For Theon himself, his ruined body never improves, but his soul does, ever so slightly, like we said. This is a man who begins in a dungeon eating a rat, terrified of even thinking about his own name. He ends not forgiven, not absolved, and certainly nowhere near happy, but better off than before. He takes back some level of his previous identity, his sense of self. He dares to break through that amazing mental stranglehold that Ramsay has on him to be the hero, or at least do the heroic act of saving Jane at the end. And we know George spends a whole book setting up how strong that grip is that Ramsay has. So for Theon to actually break through that, it really is an incredible moment. The amount of fear and bravery that goes into that moment is very, very emotional. And part of him getting to that point is the return to Winterfell and what that does for himself, what that does for his self-examination of looking back at his time with the Starks and what Ned did, and what having that incredible moment of admitting that it was all because he actually wanted to be part of the family. He didn't hate them, really. That's his big breakthrough. Now, we could have guessed much of this back in Clash, but it really does frame that whole Clash arc differently as we see the transition from Reek to Tool of the Boltons to some memory of Theon. Now, he's also incredibly useful as a camera here. Unfortunately for us, that does mean we have to be up very close to Ramsay and his absolute horribleness and vileness for much of this book. And I like to view Ramsay as George giving himself the Joffrey that he didn't get to write, thanks to Joffrey's death. I think George probably quite liked writing Joffrey as a hell of a character, so he has to be killed off. And this is boring, I don't have any absolute psychopaths to write about now. I know, I'll make a new one, a grown-up one, so I can have all these extra aspects of it, because Ramsay is little more than a fully grown Joffrey, whereas evil has been allowed to grow untethered. It's manifested itself into sexual violence as well now, and you can't tell me that Joffrey wouldn't adore this psychological horror and breaking of spirit that Ramsay has done to Theon. Ramsay, like Joffrey, is the most annoying type of villain. They're not even true antagonists in the way that a Peter Baelish, a Euron Greyjoy, even a Cersei Lannister, or definitely the others, are. At least those guys all have goals. And you can even throw Roose Bolton in there if you want. Ramsay is just horrible for horribleness' sake. He doesn't want to do anything, he just likes being evil. He's just a spoiled brat who's never been told no, combined with this seeming rotting and corruption of his and Joffrey's soul. They're both just straight evil. So yeah, I think Ramsay is our new Joffrey basically for the next act of this series. But if we can get through those first few chapters, Theon shows us the major advancements on one side of the Northern War. He has the opening of Moat Cailin, the journey to Winterfell, and then most importantly, this incredibly interesting mix of factions we get inside Winterfell with the Boltons and the Freys and the Manderleys and everyone else. I feel personally, that was a real highlight of this book and something we've all looked at and discussed a lot in looking forward to this Battle of Ice. Everything looks incredibly bleak from Ash's point of view, which we'll discuss in a second. Even from what Jon hears about Stannis, it all seems like it's just Stannis is going to lose, straight up. Which is why it's great to have Theon on the other side and actually see the reality, how close Roose's plan is to collapse. To see Wyman Manderley basically straight up trolling everybody, and that's without mentioning all the other tidbits of Mance. We get the history of Brandon Stark and Barbary Dustin. We get this murder mystery later on, and all this stuff. It's a great arc, especially at the end. Well, I say that, but not really, because we also have to be reintroduced to Jane Poole. And while I love Jane Poole, I definitely don't want to be reintroduced to what's happened to her, or what is going to happen to her in this book. And I say this with being as genuine as I can. I honestly think that'll be the most difficult part of this whole series to analyse and for me to actually talk about with you guys. I do not want to do it. Luckily it's not for a while yet, but my good God. Now, my personal favourite thing about Theon's late dance book is that we get Winterfell, number one, but Winterfell in winter. We've not had that before. It was still the tail end of summer, maybe beginning of autumn, last time we were there. Winterfell is built for winter, surprisingly, and now we get to see it. We get to see Winterfell at night under the stars and Winterfell getting buried in the snow. It's a completely different, dark, creepy atmosphere that chills you as you read it. This is a very different place. Now it's just superb, and we combine that with a return to the Winterfell places that we know and love. We go back to the Great Hall, we revisit the crypts, we go along the walls, which we haven't actually got a good look at before, and of course the Godswood, the Weirwood itself. Yeah, I'll lap that stuff up all day. So it's a shame that Theon ends up leaving again, but he may yet return. It's definitely one of the more exciting endings of this whole book. Now, that's a whole lot about Theon, but what about on the other side here? Because we have his sister. We have Asher, who actually has differently titled chapters, like her brother and like many others. So we might only have 3 from her, but they're an awesome 3. She starts off with the moonlit battle at Deepwood Motte, which is just beautiful writing. It's a really cool battle to read about. And then she does turn into a bit of a Stannis cam as we witness his journey and her journey faltering along thanks to the weather, before that final chapter of hers where we really see how bad things are for Team Stannis, as well as the many different factions at work there, much like Theon. Now, to be fair, in Roos's camp with Theon, it seems to be a much more volatile situation than what Stannis has got going on, but Stannis is in the worst physical situation where they are dying out there. It's in her middle chapter. It starts off well, they're going pretty fast on this march, the snow comes down, things get worse. In her final chapter, things are really bad, and then we do have this really interesting north-south divide between Stannis' forces, so that's great to read. But Asher herself, she's also completely changed position from where we've seen her before. She was the suave leader, at ease everywhere that she goes, but now she's gone from having her own castle to being a prisoner, to trying to stay away from being burnt alive, yet she's still super cool. And I'd say my favourite thing about her arc is the greater examination we get to see of who she is as a leader, even in these very, very difficult, very different circumstances. And it's pretty damn great. So much appreciation of Asher that I look forward to looking at her chapters. So that's the north. In geographic areas, it gets a little more difficult now, at least in Westeros. If we move down below the neck, we only have the one chapter in the Riverlands with Jaime, which is very late in the book as we discussed earlier, and that is obviously a huge departure from the first 4 books. Whether via Catelyn, Arya, Jaime or Brienne, the Riverlands have always been a major part of the story. So this is something very new to us, and definitely an aspect why some, like myself, aren't as big a fan of Dance as the others. Now, Dawn is much the same with the lone Areo Hotar chapter, even if that does give us a lot of setup for the future, and we do at least have some Dornish connections in Quentyn. But that one chapter, we're not really spending a lot of time in Dawn or the Riverlands, unfortunately. Now, King's Landing and the Eastern Coast will see a late resurgence with Cersei's 2 chapters, Kevin's epilogue, and the late coming of Jon Connington and the Golden Company. We'll talk about those guys in a second, because Cersei is clearly the bigger interest. She's a huge interest to us, given her massive importance in Feast and the gigantic cliffhanger she was left on. And things don't actually improve much for Cersei in her first chapter, as she learns a bit more about all the changes in King's Landing, but come on, I know, no one really cares about that first chapter. It's her second, her Walk of Shame chapter, that is so famous. I know some fans who always think that it was in Feast, because you just can't imagine having to wait for it so long. This is a massive chapter that is incredible and painful and raw to read. It's some of George's very best work in terms of making us feel bad for characters we hate again, like with Theon, and ends with that slight tiny promise of Cersei returning to power. And there's obviously so much we're going to talk about thematically and what we learned of Cersei in Feast and historically as well. There's so many connections to make in that chapter, so that is really going to be expect a long episode that day when we get to that chapter. But that is put in perfect contrast by the epilogue with Kevin, which I know we're also very much looking forward to. Even if it is very far in the future, we are looking forward to it, because it's an absolute classic of a chapter with a ton of hints and tidbits for stuff going forward. Undoubtedly, it is our best epilogue yet. Apologies to Merritt, but Merritt is cool that he was backwards facing. That was about the Red Wedding, really, and this one reveal of Stoneheart. Kevin, he gets a big reveal in at the end as well, but there's just so much more set up for Winds and Beyonds, which, again, we'll get to. We're going to watch the death of a really awful guy, so that's fun. But we also lose an absolute constant in Pycelle, who's just always been there, and now he's not going to be. And we get the return of a once constant character in Varys, this other thing that we've been waiting for so long, and it's obviously a brilliant thematic close to the book as we link up this whole very prevalent idea of Aegon the Sixth, as well as finally having the reveal of who Varys really is in some respects. Anyway, we at least know his motivation now, which is something we've been wondering about for a very long time, so it's a brilliant end to the book. We look forward to that. And that's actually quite a good segue over to Essos now. Now, Essos has been present in every book so far, but not like this. Feast broke the record with having just 2 POVs on that continent, in Arya and Sam, and Sam only pops his head in. Now we've got a whole party going on over there. And really, Essos can be split into 2 halves with some leftovers. There's Daenerys stuff, fake Aegon stuff, and then you get 2 Aryas, and maybe you can throw the Victorians in there as well. Even though he is geared towards Daenerys, he doesn't actually get anywhere near in this book. Now, Arya chapters we can kind of fly by for our purposes here. Her arc is mainly just a continuation of Faceless Men progress. She earns her eyes back, she gets ready for her first assassination. I don't think either of these chapters are any more memorable than her Feast chapters, and this is kind of more just a formatting timing issue in that they've got to go somewhere, so we'll kind of put them here. Now I might be proved wrong, maybe there are some kind of time restraints that make them be put in this place specifically. We'll have to look for that as we go. Victorian is far more interesting as he starts getting more involved with the typical SOC aspects of the Red Guard and weird things going on with fire, and him just entering, well, it's gone from one kind of magic thing with Euron to a different one now. He has his hand weirdly saved with magic and or religion, whatever you want to call it. We confirm that he does want Dany for himself, like we guessed at the end of his Feast arc, but far more interestingly, we get way more info on the Horn and Dragonbinder and what it can be used for in terms of dragons. So Victorian is also kind of just more set up for wins than actually affecting anyone else in this book specifically, but it's very, very interesting that we're really dying to get to. But let's move on to the bigger ones. Let's move on to Jon Connington, our new boy. He actually splits his 2 chapters, one in Essos and one in Westeros, as Tyrion takes most of the responsibility for the early fake Aegon journey. As mentioned earlier, it's a hell of a character to get inside given his history, which is obviously key in this new plot thread around young Griff, fake Aegon, whatever you want to call him. And he mainly serves first as an introduction to the Golden Company and what they'll be used for and their history, but also as a continuation of this Varys Illyrio theme of not accounting for the human element in your plans. This man, Jon Connington, has dedicated 20 odd years of his life to a plan that basically focuses almost exclusively on the young lad next to him. But that young lad, with a bit of a nudge from Tyrion, is evolving into his own character, as complex and unreliable as any that George cares to pen. Young Griff wants to do things his way, screw the plan, and to be fair, Jon Con does get on board with that pretty quick. It is a big decision that Tyrion nudges young Griff into, of going west before going to Daenerys. That is going to change a lot. We've already seen it, but obviously by series end we're really going to be looking back at that as a pivotal moment in the progression of the final act of the story. So really Jon Con's main purpose can be summarised as showing us the formation of how this great split between the 2 Targaryen factions comes about, and setting up the actual second dance we might see when Dany finally does come west. The name of the book is obviously quite relevant here, but probably even more so in the future. We are now very much dealing with the new state of the new Targaryen generation. Maybe that's why George wanted to spend so much time on Fire and Blood, because we're going forward into a new era of Targaryens, and obviously these 2, whatever young Griff is, they're going to be very important in the formation of it, and they're the second Targaryen invasion, whatever you want to call it. Personally, himself, Jon Con also gets quite a lot in for just 2 chapters. We have the regrets of the rebellion, which includes guilt over not protecting Rhaegar's wife and children, plus guilt at not burning down a village full of people. So quite the spectrum there. We have that Tywin-ness angle, that's one we're all looking forward to seeing develop. Well, perhaps not looking forward to, but we expect to develop. That's in there for a reason, isn't it? Jon Con is probably going to do something bad based on wanting to be more like Tywin, especially as George has added a countdown clock in his grayscale. Now, interestingly, that aspect is actually introduced at the end of his first chapter, not his second, so we're well aware of it by the time he returns to his home, where nostalgia is obviously even more rampant. We get to ask grand questions of what the plan for Stone's End is. Will Jon Con actually live long enough to see his success? And will he learn maybe the truth about young Griff. And if that is the truth, that he's not Aegon the Sixth, how much will that destroy Jon Con? And will he be able to keep control of this new leader, whoever he is, whatever we find out? Will he be able to keep control of him as he is about to be introduced to the world at large, especially if dragons eventually get involved? So Jon is really going to be a major viewpoint of importance going into Winds, as we assume he'll be at King's Landing, and along with Arianne and Cersei, be a big window into what is happening there. Again, this whole plot thread is going to be huge, really, really big, and a lot of this reread has been building up to it in the first place. So everyone else remaining that we haven't spoken about yet is really revolving around Daenerys. And aren't we all, really, if we're being honest? Quentyn has the, again, much analysed arc of basically failure. The Prince of Dawn, perhaps its heir if everything went to plan, fell prey to George insisting on showing us another reason that the fairy tales and songs should not be taken to heart. He's a young man, off for adventure, like his boat, and finds that he stinks, like his boat. Worse than stinks, it's siege warfare and disease, cannibalism and battle, double-crossing, redouble-crossing, and the death of good friends, only for it all to end in a kind of wet, dull thud when he meets Daenerys. He achieves his goal, and nothing happens. He meets her, says something, that's about it. Well, that's at first anyway. That's not his actual ending, is it? We should consider that in a book full of people trying to get to Daenerys, Quentyn is actually the only one who manages it. But it doesn't matter. He can't just whisk her into the sunset. The situation is far, far too complicated for that. So was it all worth it? Killing people in battle and switching sides and dragging your friends into hell or death all for nothing? No, Quentyn wants to do right by his father and his kingdom, so he decides to go for broke, or rather, burnt. Here's a hell of an arc to fit in just 4 chapters, with a couple of cameos in Dany's chapters as well, and one in which George gets across a definite message. Again, the clue is in the name. If you dance with dragons, you probably end up as toast. Now Tyrion and Dany, well, we could spend another hour talking about those two. We likely don't need to talk about them too much now, seeing as we will spend so much time really diving into their arcs and the weight they bring to the narrative in their many, many chapters, especially early on. Tyrion will actually open the book proper after Varamir, and Daenerys isn't too far behind, so we won't have to wait too long for that. To round it up very quickly, Daenerys is nearly a straight replication of Jon's struggle with leadership. We did mention a bit of this earlier. Although she leans very heavily into another identity crisis as well. Does she do more good as a floppy-eared rabbit or as a fire-breathing dragon? Guilt and the need to save as many people as possible point her towards the ears at first, but the natural frustration of someone of her age, combined with the situation she's in, push her ever more back towards the dragon, until she finally makes a huge leap in terms of Targaryen progression, both physically and emotionally, by riding upon a now grown, at least semi-grown, Drogon, as well as electing to screw the bunny ears and become a dragon herself in her final chapter. Needless to say, we will be covering this plenty in Dany's biggest ever book, biggest since Game anyway. Tyrion we also know very well. The deep dive into the dire state of his soul, especially in the first half of the book. There's the half-hearted hunt for Tysha, the continued hatred for Tywin, for Cersei, even for Jaime. The very difficult part of seeing a once favourite character become a rapist, a nihilist, and generally just not be very nice to anyone, mixed with at least glimpses of his former self coming back to the surface. Unfortunately, that comes after setting this second dance in motion, thanks to that Savas game with young Griff. And his viewing of the world, especially a dwarf's world, via the eyes of Penny, and then of himself when he becomes a slave. This is all very, very different for Tyrion. Now again, much analysed, it's much spoken of, and it's a truly heavy read that we'll be spending a lot of time with, so let's push on here. Don't want this episode to last too long. Let's finish up with Sir Barry, our newest POV, and he's the last to be introduced in this book as well. And he's also actually given perhaps the title of most frequent in the book, given that his 4 chapters all come in the final 14 of the book, so we get a lot of him very quick. Through him, we see the consequences of a marine without its queen, the preparations for battle, and a really cool duel, actually. Unfortunately, we also have some opinion-changing stuff on Barry's past and his attitudes to certain things, and some setup of further change in Marine, whether he realises it or not. But all in all, there is some pretty big chapters going on late there, so we look forward to that. And that is everyone, I believe. I don't think I've left anyone out. Correct me if I have. As you can see or hear, we've got lots to consider, so make sure you are prepared when Scraps and Scrolls and Valar Rereadis does kick off. This is a big old book, everybody. It's a dark book. It's one where not much good happens. In fact, a lot of really bad things happen. And yet there are seeds of things that we want to see being sowed. Yeah, that's a hard sentence to say. Winterfell is brought back to us. Dany does progress on her dragon skills and gets out of Marine. Bran does become a bit more powerful. Perhaps Rickon's return is even hinted at. There are things we can grasp to. So what a shame that all that is due to be followed by the darkest book in the series, which really does make you think about what Winds is going to be. Check back on this once we've finished Dance, once we've got through all these really horrible things happening to our main characters, but to the world in general. I think that's a big part of Dance. We open the lens a bit more to see what's going on with everyone, like Feast did in Westeros. We get that a bit more in Essos this time round, and then consider that George says it's going to get worse. That Winds is going to be a sledgehammer in our face, truly. But it will have to wrestle that title out of Dance with Dragons' claws. Dance has the unfortunate distinction of being both about the fallout of war and the build-up to war again. Let's remember, this book was supposed to end with 2 huge battles, probably the 2 biggest we've ever seen. Now, okay, they got pushed back. Can't do anything about that now. We all lament it, but that's how it is. But we can feel that rising, bubbling tension of things are bad, 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 bad. And then they kind of explode into everything getting much worse at the end, which was obviously the link in to Winds of Winter. So I guess George is actually borrowing some of Dance's horribleness for Winds of Winter. Maybe that's why he gets the title. In general, the cold comes in, cannibalism is rife. Now we have disease in at least one corner, maybe 2, a horn that can steal a dragon, an elephant-laden army coming to the capital. Our 3 biggest characters, a slave, a captive of the Dothraki, or supposedly dead, up in the north, and the others, they are coming ever closer. Dance is a book of many things, but its biggest point has to be the dedication and focus to the wall and the dragons, both thematically and in human form. Now, I've said The Dance of the Dragons is a title about Daenerys and Aegon VI. Certainly fits, but you can also look at it as this is a book about Jon and Daenerys. It is about dragons thematically and in human form. We are entering the end, it seems to say. These 2 are the 2 biggest points. They're the biggest characters when you really get down to it. More than any other, this is a book belting out a tune about ice and fire as it preps for those 2 big battles of each, the ones that were supposed to cap it off. Like I said, we were denied that, but we still get the build-up, the sense of atmosphere, this feeling that we're coming towards the ends of the series. So this is incredibly valuable for that reason alone, and it is a hell of a book that I'm sure you look forward to getting to, and so do I. So that is our primer. That is our prepper episode. That's a lot of talk we probably will have forgotten by the time we get to a lot of these chapters and characters that we're not going to see for a long time. But whenever we do kick off, we'll have Branmir and Tyrion and Daenerys and Jon, and it's going to keep going from there and never really let us go. It is a big old book, the second biggest in the series, if I remember rightly, only slightly behind Storm, so it's important, everybody. And I hope you'll like coming along for the ride again. Thank you if you intend to do so. Thank you for the first 4 books as well. It is a hell of a ride. So that's it. I'll leave you there. Enjoy the remainder of the break. Enjoy whatever else the fandom is chucking out, because, like I say, it comes left, right and centre. If you'd like to look at our Patreon and get that Storm's End episode, please do. I'll have a video kind of episode, hopefully up soonish. And, well, it won't be too long before we're on the Isle again. So thanks, everybody, and I'll see you next time.